The garage smelled of cold concrete and old oil, the kind of smell that clings to a room that long after the machines have gone quiet. The Maserati sat in the center of it like a rebuke, silver, silent, and dead, for the fourth month running. Renata Voss, CEO of Voss Meridian Group, stood at the edge of the bay in a charcoal blazer and looked at the janitor who had stepped forward from the back wall. He was holding a mop. She looked at him the way a person looks at a chair that has spoken. "Someone get this man out of my garage," she said, and the specialists around her laughed, and the press crew in the corner kept filming. He did not know that she had just asked to be escorted out of the room by the only person in the building who had ever built that engine by hand. His name was Marcus Hale. And what happened next changed everything. The Maserati in question was a 1972 Ghibli SS, chassis number AM115 491847, and it had not run under its own power since the previous October. That was the month Renata Voss had acquired it at a private auction in Geneva for a figure her publicist described only as significant. The figure, as Marcus would later learn from a billing summary left on a workbench, was $412,000. The subsequent repair campaign, 7 specialists across 4 countries, 2 engine rebuilds, 1 complete electrical overhaul, and a carburetor replacement, sourced from a collector in Bologna, had added another $390,000. The car still would not start. Marcus Hale had been the night shift custodian at Voss Meridian's private automotive facility in Scottsdale for 11 months. He arrived each evening at 9, worked until 4 in the morning, and was gone before the day staff came in. He swept, he mopped, he emptied the steel bins beside each lift, and wiped the grease from the painted floor markings with a rag he kept folded in his back pocket. He did not speak unless spoken to. Most of the day, staff did not know his last name. He did not know on the morning he stepped forward that the room was full of cameras. He had not planned to step forward at all. He had come in early that day because Lily had a school event at noon, and he needed to swap his shift, and the building manager, a soft-spoken man named Danny Reyes, who had worked facilities for 20 years, had said it was fine. Danny was the only person at Voss Meridian who knew anything about Marcus's previous life. And even Danny did not know all of it. He knew that Marcus had a daughter named Lily, who was 7 years old, and carried a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Ears everywhere she went. He knew that Marcus's wife, Claire, had died 22 months earlier from a brain aneurysm that gave no warning and asked no permission. He knew that Marcus had left a job somewhere in Europe to come back to Arizona, and that whatever the job had been, it had paid considerably more than custodial work. What Danny did not know was the specific shape of what Marcus had left behind. Marcus Hale had spent 9 years on the production floor of Officine Alfieri Maserati's restoration and racing preparation division in Modena, Italy. He had started as an apprentice at 24, the only American in a cohort of 12, and had risen to lead technician by his 31st birthday. He had built engines from bare castings. He had blueprinted blocks by hand, measured tolerances in microns, and signed off on the final assembly of 6 cars that went on to win at Goodwood. He had, specifically, spent 14 months working on the AM-115 platform, the Ghibli SS, during a factory-sponsored restoration program that passed from 2009 to 2011. He knew the engine's particular pathologies the way a doctor knows a patient's chart. He had written 2 of those pathologies into an internal technical memo that the factory had filed and apparently never distributed to the broader specialist community. He had come back to the United States when Claire was diagnosed with the aneurysm, which had not yet ruptured, but which her neurologist described as a question of when, not if. He had come back because Lily was 4 years old, and he had decided, with the quiet finality of a man who has already done the math, that he would not be the kind of father who was on another continent when the question answered itself. He had taken the custodial job because it paid enough, because the hours let him be home when Lily woke up, and because nobody asked him questions about his resume. He had told himself that the work was temporary. He had been telling himself that for 11 months. Claire had died on a Tuesday in March, in a hospital room that smelled of recycled air and the faint sweetness of the hand lotion her sister kept applying to her hands, as though warmth were a form of argument. Marcus had been holding Lily on his lap in the waiting room when the doctor came through the door, and Lily had been pressing Mr. Ears against her cheek, and Marcus had looked at the doctor's face and known before a single word was spoken. He did not speak about Claire at work. He did not speak about Madna. He swept the floors and emptied the bins and went home before dawn. And on the mornings when Lily woke up early and came to find him at the kitchen table, he made her toast with the crusts cut off and listened to her explain the internal politics of her first-grade classroom with the focused attention of a man who understood that this was the most important briefing of his day. The morning of the press event, Lily had come with him because the school event had been canceled. She sat in Danny's small office off the main corridor, Mr. Ears in her lap, drawing horses on the back of a facilities schedule. Danny had given her a cup of apple juice and a packet of crackers and told her she could stay as long as she needed. She had thanked him with the grave formality of a child who has learned that adults deserve courtesy. Marcus had been in the corridor outside the main bay when he heard the engine, or rather, when he heard the absence of it. He heard the starter motor cycling. He heard the particular rhythm of a car that was trying and failing, the brief cough and the long silence, the brief cough and the long silence. He had heard that rhythm before. He had heard it in a technical memo he had written himself, in a paragraph that described a non-standard vacuum advance unit that had been installed in a recalled production batch of AM-115 engines between chassis numbers 1840 and 1860 A unit that behaved normally in warm conditions and failed completely in cold starts below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The Scottsdale facility ran its climate control at 62 degrees to preserve the paint on the stored vehicles. He had stepped into the doorway. He had looked at the car. He had read the chassis plate from across the room. He did not move immediately. He stood in the doorway with his mop and looked at the plate and did the arithmetic that he had done 11 years ago in a workshop in Modena, and the arithmetic came out the same way it always had. Then Renata Voss had seen him standing there. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when someone with authority decides to make a point. Renata was not a cruel person by nature, but she was a precise one. And she had a press crew filming and 7 specialists standing around a car that had cost her $800,000 and still would not start. And the sight of a custodian in the doorway was, to her, a variable that needed to be removed from the frame. "Someone get this man out of my garage," she said. The specialist laughed. The press crew kept filming. Danny, standing near the back wall, looked at the floor. Marcus did not move. He did not flush or flinch or apologize. He looked at Renata Voss with the calm of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. He said quietly that he thought he knew what was wrong with the car. The laughter stopped. The press crew had arrived at 7 that morning, 2 hours before Renata Voss, and they had set up in the northeast corner of the bay with the practiced efficiency of people who had been promised a story and intended to collect it. The story, as pitched to the automotive journalist Elena Marsh of Strata magazine, was a triumph. The CEO of Voss Meridian Group, one of the Southwest's most prominent luxury acquisition firms, had rescued a rare Maserati Ghibli SS from decades of neglect and restored it to running condition through an unprecedented investment in specialist expertise. Elena had brought a photographer named Theo and a sound technician whose name Marcus never learned. They had been filming for 2 hours before Marcus appeared in the doorway. Renata Voss arrived at 9:15 in a black SUV and walked into the bay with the unhurried confidence of a person who owns the room. She was 53, precise in her movements, and wore her authority the way she wore her blazer, without apparent effort, as though both had been tailored to fit. She greeted Elena Marsh by first name, shook hands with the lead specialist, a German engine consultant named Dr. Franz Kellner, who had flown in from Stuttgart for the 3rd time in 4 months, and then stood at the front of the car and waited for it to perform. Dr. Kellner tried the ignition, the starter cycled, the engine coughed. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that costs money. Renata's expression did not change. She had the face of a person who has learned to absorb bad news without letting it show, which was a skill that had served her well in business and had cost her something in other rooms. She looked at Kellner. Kellner looked at the floor. The 6 other specialists, a carburetor specialist from Lyon, an electrical systems consultant from Milan, a fuel delivery expert from Phoenix, and 3 others whose credentials Marcus had never learned, stood in a loose semicircle and said nothing. It was into this silence that Marcus had appeared. When he said he thought he knew what was wrong, Renata Voss looked at him for a long moment. She took in the mop. She took in the gray uniform with the Voss Meridian Facilities patch on the shoulder. She looked at Danny Reyes, who was standing near the back wall with his arms folded and his eyes on the floor. And then she looked back at Marcus. "This is a 1972 Maserati Ghibli SS," she said. "It has been examined by 7 of the top engine specialists in Europe and North America. What exactly do you think you know about it?" She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The press crew was filming. The specialists were watching. Lily, in Danny's office down the corridor, was drawing horses and pressing Mr. Ears against her cheek and could not hear any of it, and Marcus was grateful for that. He said the chassis number was AM115491847. Renata said that was correct. He said the engine was a 4.9-liter V8 factory build, and that the chassis fell within a recalled production batch that had been fitted with a non-standard vacuum advance unit, a Morelli variant that had been substituted during a parts shortage in late 1971, and that failed to hold vacuum below a threshold ambient temperature. He said the facility was climate controlled to 62 degrees. He said the unit needed to be replaced with the correct specification part, which was a standard Morelli 3461880, and that the replacement would take approximately 9 minutes. The room was very quiet. Dr. Kellner, who had spent 4 months and a considerable portion of Renata's budget on this car, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing his words, that there was no documentation of such a recall in any of the standard reference materials. Marcus said that the documentation existed in an internal technical memo filed with the factory in Modena in 2011. He said he knew this because he had written it. Elena Marsh stopped writing in her notebook. Theo lowered his camera slightly. Renata Voss looked at Marcus Hale with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. He did not explain further. He did not list his credentials or describe his years in Modena or mention Claire or Lily or the reasons he was holding a mop in a facility that housed a car he had once known better than almost anyone alive. He simply waited. Renata said, after a pause that felt longer than it was, "Show me." Danny had the parts room open in 4 minutes. Marcus had worked in the facility long enough to know where the legacy stock was kept, and he had seen the correct Morelli unit on a shelf 6 months ago when he was cleaning the storage corridor, and had noted it the way he noted everything, quietly, without comment, filing it away in the part of his mind that never fully stopped working. The unit was there. He carried it to the bay in his hands. He set the mop against the wall. He did not ask for a lift or a light or an assistant. He opened the hood of the Ghibli and stood over the engine for a moment in the particular stillness of a person who is reading something. And then he began. Danny watched from the side of the bay. He had his arms folded and his mouth slightly open, and he watched Marcus work the way a person watches something they cannot quite believe is happening in front of them. The specialist watched too. Dr. Kellner had his hands in his pockets and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who is waiting to be wrong. Marcus worked without hurry. His hands moved with the economy of someone for whom this was not a performance but a task, and the task had a correct sequence, and he followed the sequence the way a musician follows a score, not because he needed to think about it, but because the thinking had already been done years ago in a workshop in Modena, and what remained was only the execution. 8 minutes and 53 seconds after he began, he closed the hood. He stepped back. He looked at Danny, who was the closest person to him, and Danny gave him the smallest nod. Marcus said, to no one in particular, that someone could try the ignition. Renata Voss walked to the driver's door herself. She sat down. She turned the key. The engine started on the first try, settled into a low, even idle, and held it. The sound it made was the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. Elena Marsh wrote something in her notebook. Theo raised his camera. Doctor. Kellner looked at the floor again, but for a different reason than before. Renata Voss sat in the car for a moment, with both hands on the wheel, and said nothing. Then she got out. The vacuum advance unit sat on the workbench afterward, small and unremarkable, the kind of component that a person would hold in one hand and mistake for nothing important. Danny Reyes picked it up and turned it over, and looked at it for a long time. He had been in facilities management for 20 years and had worked around cars his whole life, and he could not have told anyone what he was looking at. He set it back down carefully, as though it had earned that. The fault itself was not mysterious, once someone knew where to look. That was the nature of it. The Morelli variant, part number 3461882, as opposed to the correct 3461880, had been substituted during a 6-week parts shortage at the Modena factory in the autumn of 1971, affecting a run of approximately 40 engines. The variant was dimensionally identical to the correct unit and performed within normal parameters in ambient temperatures above 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that threshold, the diaphragm material, a slightly different compound, sourced from a secondary supplier during the shortage, lost sufficient elasticity to maintain vacuum under cold start conditions. The engine would crank. The starter motor would engage. The fuel delivery was correct. Everything looked right, and nothing worked. 7 specialists had spent 4 months and $800,000 examining everything that looked right. Marcus had known about the fault since 2011. He had identified it during the factory restoration program when a chassis in the AM115 batch, number 1851, 2 cars up the line from Renata's, had presented the same symptoms in the Modena workshop during a cold February. He had spent 3 days tracing it before he found the diaphragm compound discrepancy. And then he had written the memo and filed it and moved on to the next car. He had not thought about it again until he heard the starter motor cycling in the Scottsdale Bay, and the sound of it arrived in his memory like a key finding a lock. He did not know, standing at the workbench while Danny turned the unit over in his hands, that Elena Marsh was still in the building. She had stayed after the others began to disperse, standing near the northeast corner with her notebook and the quiet patience of a journalist who understands that the story she came for has been replaced by a better one. She had watched Marcus work. She had timed it on her phone. She had written down the chassis number and the part number and the phrase Internal Technical Memo, Modena, 2011, and she had already begun composing the questions she intended to ask. Danny had sent Lily in from the office when the engine started. She had come through the door with Mr. Ears under one arm and the facility schedule covered in horses under the other, and she had looked at the Maserati idling in the center of the bay with the mild interest of a child who has grown up around her father's quiet competence and has learned not to be surprised by it. She had walked to Marcus and leaned against his leg and said, without looking up, "Did you fix it, Dad?" He had said yes. She had said, "Was it the cold thing?" He had looked down at her. He had not told her about the fault. He had not told her about the car or the facility or any of it. She was 7 years old, and she knew about engines the way children know about the things their parents love, not through instruction, but through proximity, through the particular texture of a parent's attention when something matters to them. He said it was. She nodded and went back to her horses. Danny watched this exchange and said nothing, which was the correct response. The day-numbered work had begun, in Marcus's mind, the moment he heard the starter cycling, though he had not known then that it would take a day at all. He had arrived at the facility at 7:45 in the morning, 45 minutes before his shift was scheduled to begin, because Lily's school event had been canceled, and he needed to adjust his hours. He had heard the cycling at 8:10. He had stepped into the doorway at 8:12. He had been escorted, or rather had been told to leave, which was not quite the same thing, at 8:14, when Renata Voss had said what she said, and the room had laughed. He had not left. He had stayed in the doorway for a moment after the laughter, and then he had said what he said, and the room had changed. Day one was the repair itself. 9 minutes of work, preceded by 4 months of other people's failure, and the work was not dramatic in the way that the failure had been dramatic. The failure had been expensive and public and well documented. The repair was quiet and fast and witnessed by a room full of people who were not sure what they were seeing. Marcus had not explained himself while he worked. He had not narrated the steps or described the fault or pointed to the diaphragm compound for the benefit of the cameras. He had simply worked, and the car had started, and that was the documentation. Danny had pulled the parts inventory after, cross-referencing the shelf stock against the facility's purchase records, and had found that the correct Morelli unit had been in storage for 8 months, sorted by a previous specialist who had apparently never used it. The unit had been sitting on a shelf in the storage corridor 6 meters from the car. Marcus had walked past it dozens of times with his mop. He had known what it was every time. He had not said anything, because nobody had asked him. Elena Marsh asked him, finally, at 10:40 in the morning in the corridor outside the bay, while Lily sat on a folding chair beside him and drew a horse with an unusually long neck. Marsh asked him where he had learned about the fault. He told her about Modena, briefly and without embellishment, the way a person describes a place they have left. She asked how long he had been at the facility. He said 11 months. She asked what he did before the custodial work. He said he had been a technician. She asked where. He said Italy mostly. She wrote this down. She asked why he had taken the custodial job. He looked at Lily for a moment. Lily was adding mane to the horse, her tongue between her teeth, Mr. Ears tucked under her elbow. He said he had needed to be closer to home. Marsh wrote that down too, and did not ask the follow-up question, which was the correct instinct. The external confirmation came at 2:15 that afternoon, when Dr. Kellner, who had spent the intervening hours in the parts room with the removed unit and a vacuum gauge, walked back into the bay and confirmed, with the careful precision of a man who has been wrong and is choosing to be accurate about it, that the diaphragm compound in the removed unit was a non-standard formulation, and that the cold start failure was consistent with the fault Marcus had described. He had also, he said, located a reference to the internal Medina memo in a secondary technical archive that he had not previously consulted. The memo was dated March 2011. The author was listed as M. Hale. Kellner said this quietly to Danny, who was the only other person in the room. Danny told Marcus later, in the parking lot, while Lily ate crackers from the packet he had given her that morning. Marcus said, "I know." He was not being unkind. He simply already knew. The test drive results arrived at Derek Paulson's desk at 3:47 in the afternoon, forwarded from the facility manager's email by a routing protocol that Paulson himself had set up 18 months ago, when he had first taken the COO position at Voss Meridian. He had designed the protocol to ensure that any significant operational development at any of the company's 4 facilities reached him before it reached Renata. He had described this in the operations manual as executive information management. What it was, in practice, was a filter. Paulson was 58, with the compact, contained energy of a man who has spent a career managing the space between what is true and what is reported. He had a reputation within the company for solving problems before they became visible, and he had built that reputation carefully over many years by being faster than the problems. He read the facility manager's summary in 40 seconds. Then he read it again. The summary described a 1972 Maserati Ghibli SS, chassis AM1154 91847, that had been non-operational for 4 months, despite specialist intervention totaling approximately $800,000 in combined acquisition and repair costs. It described a facilities employee, name Marcus Hale, title night shift custodian, who had identified and corrected a vacuum advance fault in 8 minutes and 53 seconds using a part already in storage. It included a note from Dr. Franz Kellner confirming the diagnosis and citing a 2011 Maserati factory technical memo authored by the same employee. It included a note from the facility manager, a cautious man named Greg Torres, that Eleanor Marsh of Strata magazine had been present and had conducted a brief interview with the employee in question. Paulson set the summary down and looked at the window for a moment. He did not know that Danny Reyes had already made a copy of the summary and saved it to a personal drive. The problem, as Paulson understood it, was not the car. The car was running. That was fine. The problem was the shape of the story that the car's repair created. And the shape was this. A custodian had done in 9 minutes what 7 build specialists had failed to do in 4 months, and a journalist had been present for all of it. And the billing records for those 4 months were, if examined carefully, not a document that Voss Meridian wanted examined carefully. The specialists had been engaged through a consulting arrangement that Paulson had structured, and the arrangement included a referral fee that flowed back through a subsidiary that Renata did not know existed. $800,000 in specialist fees, of which a portion had moved in a direction that was not toward the car. This was the thing that Paulson needed to contain. He called the facility at 4:15 and spoke to Greg Torres and told him that the test drive results were being reviewed by the legal team before distribution and that no further communication about the Ghibli repair should go to the CEO's office until that review was complete. Torres, who was a cautious man and understood when he was being told something without being told it, said he understood. Paulson then called his assistant and asked her to draft a termination letter for a night shift custodial employee at the Scottsdale facility, citing a facility's restructuring and the elimination of the overnight shift. He asked her to have it ready by 5. He did not call Renata. Renata at 4:15 was in a meeting with her board liaison and did not know that the test drive results had arrived. She did not know that they had been intercepted. She did not know about the referral fee or the subsidiary or the shape of the billing records. She knew that her car had started that morning and that a custodian had started it, and that she had felt something in the moment after the engine caught, something she had not yet named, a quality of attention directed at a person she had dismissed, and that she had not yet decided what to do with it. She had asked Danny Reyes, before she left the facility, to find out more about the custodian. Danny had said he would. He had not yet told her what he knew, because she had been in meetings since noon, and he had not wanted to leave a message. The termination letter arrived at Marcus's home address by courier at 6:20 in the evening. It cited facilities restructuring. It offered 2 weeks of severance. It was signed by Derek Paulson on behalf of Voss Meridian Group and did not mention the Ghibli or the repair or the $800,000 or the 9 minutes. It was the kind of letter that is designed to be final without being specific, and it had the texture of something that had been written quickly by someone who needed it done before a door could open. Marcus read it at the kitchen table while Lily ate dinner. She was eating pasta with the focused concentration of a child who has decided that this particular meal is important. Mr. Ears, propped against the salt shaker, watching. Marcus read the letter twice, folded it, and set it on the table beside his fork. He did not say anything about it to Lily. She looked up from her pasta and looked at the letter and looked at him and said, "Is that from work?" He said it was. She said, "Is it bad?" He looked at her for a moment. She had Claire's eyes, the particular gray-green of them, and the same quality of attention, the kind of attention that does not look away. He said it was fine. She looked at him for another moment in the way that children look at adults when they are deciding whether to believe them, and then she went back to her pasta. Marcus sat with the letter on the table and the sound of Lily eating and the low hum of the refrigerator and thought about what he knew, which was considerable, and what he was going to do, which was not yet decided. He was not angry. He had learned in the years since Claire that anger was a response to surprise, and he had stopped being surprised by the ways that institutions protect themselves. He was something quieter than angry. He was patient. He put Lily to bed at 8:30. She asked him to tell her the story about the rabbit who could fix anything, which was a story he had been telling her since she was 4, and which had accumulated over 3 years, a mythology of considerable complexity. He told it. She fell asleep before the ending, which was always the same ending, going, "The rabbit fixed the thing, and went home and had dinner, and it was enough." Marcus turned off her light and stood in the doorway for a moment, in the dark. Then he went to the kitchen table and picked up the letter and held it, and thought about the chassis number and the memo and the 9 minutes. And Danny Reyes' copy on a personal drive and Elena Marsh's notebook. He set the letter down. He was not done. The morning of the client event arrived with the smell of fresh-cut grass and expensive coffee, the kind of corporate hospitality that costs more per head than most people earn in a day. And Renata Voss had arranged every detail of it herself. The venue was a private driving circuit 40 minutes outside the city, a pooled ribbon of tarmac lined with sponsor banners and catering tents, and the Maserati sat at the center of it all, under a white canopy, polished to a depth that seemed almost architectural. 43 people were in attendance. Investors, journalists from 2 automotive publications, the lead client, a man named Conrad Hale, no relation to the Marcus, who had flown in from Zurich specifically for this demonstration, and who had made it quietly clear through intermediaries that his decision about the seven-figure contract renewal depended on what he saw today. Renata had not told Conrad about the 9 months. She had not told him about the 7 specialists, or the $800,000, or the janitor. She had told him the car was ready. That was all. Marcus arrived with the car at 6:45 in the morning, before the caterers, before the banners were fully hung. He had driven it from the shop himself, 2 hours on the motorway, monitoring everything. The engine note was clean. The timing held. He parked it under the canopy, set the handbrake, and walked back to his truck, without speaking to anyone. He did not know that a camera crew from one of the automotive publications had been filming since dawn, capturing setup footage for a feature on corporate fleet management and the revival of classic Italian machinery. He did not know that their wide-angle lens had caught him arriving, had caught the moment he stepped out of the Maserati and closed the door, with the particular unhurried care of someone who has made a thing right and knows it. He did not know any of that. He sat in his truck and ate a sandwich Lily had helped him pack the night before. A plain thing with too much mustard because she was 6, and mustard was her current conviction. And he watched the venue fill. Conrad Hale arrived at 9. He was a compact, deliberate man in a dark suit who moved through the crowd the way water moves around stone, without friction and without hurry. He was introduced to the car by one of Renata's communications directors, a young woman who delivered the approved talking points in the approved sequence. Conrad listened. He nodded once. Then he asked to drive it. The drive lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes on a private circuit, the Maserati moving through its full range of behavior, the engine pulling cleanly through every gear, the timing advancing exactly as it should, the idle settling back to its correct register each time Conrad slowed into a corner. When he came back around and stepped out of the car, he stood beside it for a moment, with one hand resting lightly on the roof. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, "That is a well-sorted machine." It was not a dramatic statement. It was the kind of thing a man says when he means it precisely, without decoration, and Conrad Hale was that kind of man. The communications director smiled and began to move toward the talking points again, and Conrad had already turned away to find Renata. What happened next took approximately 4 minutes, though it would be discussed for considerably longer. One of the journalists, the one from the larger publication, had been doing background research for the feature. He had found the internal memo. Not a leaked copy, not a whisper from a source, but a version that had been inadvertently included in a press pack, distributed by Renata's own communications team 3 weeks earlier. A clerical error of the kind that happens when document management is poor and pressure is high. The journalist had confirmed its authenticity with 2 separate sources inside the company before the event. He had also confirmed, through those same sources, that the repair had been completed by a maintenance worker with no formal automotive certification on record at the company, a man who had spent the previous 9 months cleaning floors in the building where the car sat untouched. The journalist approached Renata at the edge of the catering tent. He was polite. He was specific. He named the memo. He named the chassis number. He named the cost. He named Marcus. Renata's face did not change immediately. The change came slowly, the way a structure settles before it fails, small and almost invisible at first, then suddenly complete. She looked across the venue toward the truck where Marcus was still sitting, the sandwich long finished, watching the circuit. She looked at the car. She looked at Conrad Hale, who was now in conversation with two of the investors, and who had the relaxed posture of a man who had already made his decision. She asked the journalist for 20 minutes. He gave her 10. Derek Paulson had been standing 12 feet away during the entire exchange, close enough to hear everything. And when Renata turned to look at him, he did not look away. He had known this moment was coming. He had, in some quiet and unconfessed part of himself, arranged for it to come. The personal drive with Danny Reyes's copy, the conversation with Elena Marsh, the careful preservation of every document in the chain, none of that had been accidental. Derek said nothing now. He simply held her gaze for a moment and then walked toward Marcus's truck. He knocked on the window. Marcus rolled it down. "She wants to speak with you," Derek said. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he got out of the truck. The conversation between Marcus and Renata lasted 6 minutes, and it happened at the edge of the canopy, away from the crowd, though not far enough away that the camera crew failed to notice it. Renata spoke first. Her voice, which had spent 9 months operating at a frequency of dismissal and command, had changed. It was quieter now, more careful. The kind of voice a person uses when they are choosing words they cannot afford to get wrong. She said that she had underestimated the situation. She said that the company owed him a proper accounting of what had been done and what had not been done, and what he had provided. She said she would like to discuss a formal consulting arrangement, a real one, with real terms. She said she was sorry for the way it had been handled. It was not quite an apology. It was the shape of one, the architecture of one, and it was more than most people in her position would have managed. Marcus listened to all of it. He looked at the car once while she spoke. Then he looked back at her. "I'll think about it," he said. That was all. No anger in it, no performance of restraint. Just a flat, measured sentence from a man who had already moved on to whatever came next, and who had never needed the moment to be larger than it was. Conrad Hale signed the renewal that afternoon. The drive home took 2 hours, the same route Marcus had taken that morning. With the Maserati now reversed in the dark, with Lily asleep in the back seat of the truck, her head tipped sideways against the door, one hand loose around the small Pretesky gear knob she had carried since the day after Claire's funeral. A thing she had found in a box in the garage and claimed without explanation, the way children claim the objects that anchor them. Marcus drove without the radio. The motorway was quiet at that hour. mostly freight, and he kept up the truck at a steady pace and watched the road, and did not think about Renata Voss or Conrad Hale or the camera that had been running since dawn. He thought about the vacuum advance. He thought about the way a system tells you what it needs if you're willing to be still and listen, and about how most people are not willing, not because they lack intelligence, but because stillness costs something that speed and credential and expensive certainty have taught them they should not have to pay. Claire had understood that. She had been a restorer herself. Furniture rather than engines, and she used to say that the object knows more than the person, that the job is just to ask the right questions and then be quiet enough to hear the answer. He had heard her say it so many times that it had stopped sounding like wisdom and started sounding like weather, like something simply true about the world. He pulled into the driveway at 11:30. The garage light was on. He had left it on that morning without thinking, the way he always did. A 40-watt bulb in a fixture that had been there since before he bought the house, casting its particular yellow square across the driveway. And he sat in the truck for a moment, looking at it before he got out. He lifted Lily from the back seat without waking her. She was heavier than she used to be. He carried her inside and put her in her bed and set the brass gear knob on the nightstand beside her, and she turned once in her sleep and was still. He went back out to the garage and stood in the light of it for a while, not doing anything, just standing in the smell of oil and old rubber and the specific silence of a space where work gets done. And he thought that this was enough, not a small enough, a real one. The ones who look carefully, who resist the noise of consensus and the comfort of expensive failure, they do not always get the credit first. Sometimes they get it late. Sometimes they get it quietly, in a driveway in the yellow light of a 40-watt bulb, with a child asleep inside. Marcus turned off the garage light. He went to bed.